Hey, everybody. Welcome into the show today. Thank you for making this podcast a part of your day. Wherever you're watching or listening to this, hit that subscribe button so this podcast will be in your feed 6 times a week, whether it's on YouTube or on Apple or Spotify. This podcast is 100% honest, 100% of the time. I've got some topics for you today, so stick with me. The overarching topic that is going to be discussed is how embarrassed the Minnesota Vikings should be after their despicable finish to the season in which they lost back-to-back games against the Lions and Rams, which coincidentally they did earlier in the season too. It's the classic situation that could only happen to Minnesota Vikings sports fans. And the situation that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to get to shortly. But there was a very intriguing statistic that I saw online. And all year long, there was a discussion about how elite the NFC North was compared to other NFL divisions. And it was hard to argue any of it because of the records. At one point, every team in the NFC North had a winning record. I think the Chicago Bears were 4-2, but until they gave up a last-second Hail Mary against the Washington Commanders. So, Vikings had a winning record, Lions had a winning record, Packers had a winning record, Bears had a winning record. And of course, the conclusion that everyone is going to receive or come to following those winning records is that the Minnesota Vikings, the Detroit Lions, the Green Bay Packers, and the Chicago Bears play in the best division in football. And just take a look at this stat. This comes from Ben Gessling on X. It says, after going 40-11 in the regular season, the Lions, Vikings, and Packers went 0-3 in the playoffs. The 3 NFC North teams had a combined minus 11 turnover margin in their playoff losses. And this goes to a point that I made earlier in the season, and it's really becoming evident right now with that statistic. It doesn't really matter how great of football you play in September or October, as long as you're not playing bottom feeder football. It doesn't matter if you're 5-0 to start, 6-0 to start. You just can't be 0-6 or 2-4. But if you're straddling that 500 mark, or if you're 4-2, you're sitting in a pretty good spot. And if you're hot at the beginning of the season, there is no guarantee that that is going to be the result at the end of the season when games really matter. Because as exciting as it is to go 6-0 or 5-0 like the Minnesota Vikings did, those numbers are now meaningless because the Minnesota Vikings lost their wild card game against the Los Angeles Rams, and they're sitting at home. As fun as the Lions' 15-1 season was, or whatever it wasn't 15-1. What was it? 15-2? 15-1? 15-2. Vikings were 14-3. So the Detroit Lions, what were the Lions? Gosh darn it. The Lions were 15-2.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
So the Lions were 15-2, and the Minnesota Vikings were 14-3. The Green Bay Packers were 11-6. Those numbers are meaningless because those numbers did not apply to playoff success. And as exciting as the regular season was, if you're hot at the wrong time, it doesn't matter. And the Minnesota Vikings are proof of that because they were hot mid-season. Darnold was putting up his best numbers of his career. He had an 18 touchdown to 2 interception ratio to finish up the year. And then against the Detroit Lions in the final week of the year, he completely disintegrated into Sam Darnold of the New York Jets and Sam Darnold of the Carolina Panthers. And against the Rams, he literally did the exact same thing. It's like he was born again and he woke up in a Jets body. So the Minnesota Vikings, memorable year, 0-1 in the playoffs. Lions, memorable year, 0-1 in the playoffs. Green Bay Packers, not as a memorable year, but still high hopes and expectations for the playoffs. 0-1, 0-1, 0-1. Season means nothing. So going forward, the lesson that needs to be learned is that, yeah, starting out 5-0 is cool. It's much better than starting out 0-5. But if you're 4-2, if you're 3-3, you're still just fine. Because as long as you're playing your best football when it matters most in December and January, that's what counts. And that's what the Chiefs do. That's what the best teams in the football do. Yeah, the Chiefs were sensational all year long. Yeah, they had, a 15-1 record, 15-2 record this regular season. And one of those losses came in the final week of the year when they played nobody against the Broncos. But they're playing their best football in January. Travis Kelce had his best game of the year last week against the Houston Texans. That's what matters. All right, my next subject to get to. The Minnesota Vikings should be embarrassed by their performance against the Detroit Lions. And Detroit Lions fans should humble themselves because after they beat the Minnesota Vikings in week 17, week 18, they were feeling themselves. Oh, we're number one in the NFC North. We're the best team. We got Dan Campbell, Ben Johnson, and another head coach, defensive coordinator, Mr. Glenn. Oh, we're going to the Super Bowl despite all of our injuries because we're a team that overcomes obstacles, and we battle to the end, and we're going to beat everybody that comes our way because we have an unstoppable offense, and our defense is humming. In comes Jaden Daniels, and the Washington Commanders put up 38 points offensively, score a defensive touchdown in that football game, and put up 45 points against the Detroit Lions that are unstoppable. Oh, in Detroit, too. And the reason why the Minnesota Vikings should be embarrassed is because it wasn't the Detroit Lions that slowed down the Minnesota Vikings offense. It was Sam Darnold. Receivers were running wide open the entire game. Addison, Jefferson, and Darnold couldn't hit him. Maybe it's not a complete criticism of the Minnesota Vikings. Instead, it's just a complete criticism of Sam Darnold's performance in that football game. Because receivers were open all day and all night. And Sam Darnold would not pull the trigger and releasing the football. And it wasn't anything the Detroit Lions did. The guys were wide open. He wouldn't throw the ball, and when he did, he overthrew them. But here's the last few performances the Detroit Lions put up. 31, 48, 34, 9, and 45. Teams were eviscerating the Detroit Lions defense, going up and down the field, scoring whenever they wanted to. And the one outlier in their last 5 matchups was their game against the Minnesota Vikings, in which they only scored 9 points. If there is a conclusion in the Sam Darnold, do the Vikings bring him back for another year? Do they think about franchise tagging him and writing it out one more time or re-signing him to a 2 or 3 year contract? The conclusion should be to look at the Detroit Lions defensive performances in their final weeks of the year and looking at the one outlier. And the one outlier is that the Minnesota Vikings against an injured Detroit Lions defense put up 9 points, as other teams put up 45 and 48 and 34 and 31. The only way the Detroit Lions could win football games is if they outscored the other team and put up 30 to 40 points in the game. It wasn't a fact of, oh, we're going to play a low-scoring ground and pound, win 23-20 kind of football game. The only way they could win is if the offense had no margin of error and Goff was dialed in and Jahmyr Gibbs ran for 3 touchdowns. And what happened against the Commanders? The Lions got tight. Goff threw picks. They had a ton of turnovers, and they could not slow down the Washington Commanders offense led by Jaden Daniels. Jared Goff had his worst game of his season, maybe his worst game of his career, in a moment that mattered a lot for the Detroit Lions organization and fan base. 1 touchdown, 3 picks, 41.5 QBR, 59.7 passer rating. Ben Johnson had questionable play calls, got tight, put wide receiver Jamison Williams on a reverse pass when the game was in the balance. He threw a pick, game's over. So, as much as Detroit Lions fans want to credit their own team for their complete demolition of the Minnesota Vikings in the final week of the year, it was more a result of the Minnesota Vikings crapping their pants and not living up to what they did in the first 17 weeks of the year. So, or 16 weeks of the year. And that's really all what it's all about. And both NFC North teams, the Lions and Vikings and the Packers, are out of the playoffs. And they stumbled to the finish line because they did not get hot at the right time. So, as fun as the regular season was, and as exciting as the year was to see Sam Darnold resurrect his career with the Minnesota Vikings, the season's over, one and done, as well as the Lions and Packers. So, the Vikings should be embarrassed because the Lions have proved that they couldn't stop anybody during the final month of their season. They even had a bye week to prepare for their next opponent. And they had an extra week of rest. They had the home field advantage. So one of the excuses the Minnesota Vikings said, well, the Lions were so hyped and they were just so energized for that moment against the Minnesota Vikings. And it was just an impossible task for Darnold to step into Ford Field and deliver a win. Jaden Daniels just did it. And he's proven to be an exceptional football player and a unique guy that can go into any situation and win with a poised attitude. But the Minnesota Vikings got to put up more points than 9. 9! Against the Detroit Lions defense that stinks. So, there's no excuses. Just flat out embarrassment. So, that's the spitting straight facts. All right, everyone, thank you for watching this episode and making this podcast a part of your day. This podcast is on YouTube and on Apple and Spotify 6 times a week and on iHeartRadio. So wherever you are watching or listening, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be there 6 times a week. 1 day is reserved for Jesus. We take a day off a week so we can stay fresh for those next 6 days a week. Bible's right. Open your Bible. Open up Scripture. Do it. All right. Everyone, hit that subscribe button. Appreciate you making this podcast for every day and going on this podcast journey with me. Have a good one.